But we do want to move on to our special interview for the evening. One of the key architects of the food security bill, Montek Singh Ahluwalia, who now says that the total number of poor households in the country will be revised upward by at least 1 crore. And also, somewhat controversially, he said that increasing the food subsidy, which will be called for, should perhaps be paid for by cutting the fuel subsidy. He did say that this was his own view, the view of the Planning Commission.
Expanding the scope and ambit of the food security bill at a time when the fiscal deficit for the government is a huge worry, isn't that something that would perhaps make political sense but not necessarily economic sense?
Well, when you say expanding, I mean, I think putting in place a new Food Security Act is not a problem. And I would say that even the subsidies on the poor, I mean, if you increase them by 5,000 or 6,000 crores, that is not going to make a big difference to the whole budget. Budgetary issue has to be tackled as a whole. And by the way, there are other subsidies that deserve to be tackled too.
Fuel subsidies, for instance.
Absolutely. Absolutely. In fact, this is an interesting, we should persuade people that I would unhesitatingly say that the additional cost of subsidy for the poor should come out of the fuel subsidies. What's the problem with that?
And is that something that the government is examining as well?
Well, this is not on the agenda of the EGOM. I've just been saying it all the time because this is the view of the Planning Commission. Because most of the fuel subsidies are untargeted.
But there are reports also suggesting that Mrs. Sonia Gandhi is extremely keen on increasing the scope and ambit of the food security bill, and that's something that has actually led the group of ministers to go back to the drawing board.
Well, as I said, I've not seen any communication, but you know, I don't think there's any difference of opinion that the scope is going to be much more than what it is at the moment. But how much more, that's an issue. I think the key issue really is not about the BPL. The really difficult issue is the belief on the part of many civil society stakeholders that the PDS should be universal.
Right.
Now the question really is that should you and I and Prannoy have access to the PDS at 50% of the market price? If you plan to supply 35 kg to every person who has an APL card, you would need an extra 30 million tons of grain. And you cannot procure that unless you want to nationalize the food grain system.
You've been given 3 weeks to make a fresh assessment of the number of poor in the country. Quite an ambitious task.
My expectation is within about a week or 10 days, we will come to our conclusion on what to do on the poverty line and therefore on the poverty number. If you apply the Tendulkar line to the year 2004-2005, which is the last year for which we have the full sample survey, then the poverty number of poverty households would increase from about 6.5 to about 7.3 or 7.4. That depends on the exact calculations are still being done. So clearly there'll be more households that would be eligible to be considered poor.
Right, so the immediate question then is that how much will the food subsidy bill actually go up if the estimate is not the Planning Commission's estimate of 6.5 crore families, but Suresh Tendulkar's estimate that pegs it at 7.5 or 8 crore families?
Well, obviously, if you increase the number of families that are eligible, the subsidy will go up. But I would say that the mere increase in the number of BPL households will not pose a huge problem. Depending on the assumption you make, I mean, the maximum impact could be of the order of 5,000 to 6,000 crores. That's it.
In fact, moving away from that entire debate on how to count the number of poor families in the country to the other big debate on the food security bill, that is the quantum of food grain to be committed and whether it should be 25 kilos or 35 kilos. What is it that you'll be recommending in your note?
One way of handling this problem, for example, is you keep the 35 kg, but on the first 25 kg you lower the price. That way you meet the obligation under both the manifesto and the President's address, and also don't reduce the present entitlement. Of course, you know, that's a very cumbersome system because, you know, very difficult to, 2 price points. So these are the issues on which the EGOM will have to take a view.
Tuba.com